Joan Rivers made Johnny Carson laugh for 20 years on The Tonight Show before he named her his permanent guest host in 1983. And then she made one decision without telling him. First, a mistake that would teach every star in Hollywood why you never cross the man who controlled everything. The king who owned his kingdom. NBC executives received a message in spring 1979 that made them physically ill. Johnny Carson was leaving. The Tonight Show generated $55 million annually, nearly one-fifth of the network's pre-tax profit. Without Carson, the franchise would collapse. The network threatened him with a $100 million lawsuit. But Carson had something NBC hadn't considered. His attorneys had examined a California statute limiting personal service contracts to 7 years. His existing NBC contract, which extended beyond 7 years, was legally void under California law. More importantly, while NBC threatened lawsuits, ABC had quietly offered to double his salary if he brought The Tonight Show to their network. For weeks, negotiations remained deadlocked. After 17 years of creating NBC's most valuable asset, Carson wanted what every artist ultimately desires: to own his own work. He understood exactly how much power he held. He wasn't bluffing about leaving NBC. The resolution represented a complete capitulation by NBC. In 1980, Carson signed an agreement that changed everything. The contract paid him $25 million per year, more than most Fortune 500 CEOs at the time, for working just 111 nights annually. But the financial terms represented only the beginning. Carson negotiated the creation of Carson Productions, a company that would own The Tonight Show itself, along with its complete archives. NBC would still broadcast the program, but Carson would own it. He wasn't merely an employee performing a service. He was a business partner who owned the intellectual property and controlled the content. The contract included another significant change. He insisted that The Tonight Show be reduced from 90 minutes to 60 minutes, and that he would host only 3 nights per week, working just 37 weeks per year. NBC had no choice but to agree. This reduction created a new time slot immediately following The Tonight Show. NBC needed programming to fill this space, which led directly to Late Night with David Letterman in 1982. Remarkably, Late Night was produced by Carson Productions, meaning Carson owned and profited from the show that followed his own program. What Carson had accomplished went far beyond securing favorable employment terms. Before his 1980 negotiation, even the biggest stars were employees who performed services in exchange for salaries. After Carson's negotiation, the most valuable performers understood they could demand ownership stakes. Carson had proven that if your value to the network was significant enough, you could force them to make you a partner rather than an employee. The contract battle revealed something essential. Power in the entertainment industry doesn't flow from corporate structures. It flows from audience connection and the revenue that connection generates. Carson commanded an audience of 15 million people every night, loyal to him specifically, not to NBC. But could he control what happened to the careers of everyone who sat on his couch? The kingmaker's gesture. Every struggling comedian in America during the 1970s and 80s shared the same dream: perform on The Tonight Show, make Johnny laugh, and experience the moment that could transform their entire life. Johnny Carson motioning them over to sit on the couch beside his desk. That gesture represented Carson's public endorsement, telling America this comedian was worth paying attention to. The wave to the couch had immediate, quantifiable economic value. Freddie Prinze discovered this in 1973 when he appeared on The Tonight Show as a 19-year-old unknown comedian. Prinze performed his set, received strong laughs, and Carson motioned him over. The appearance lasted less than 10 minutes total, but its impact was instantaneous and enormous. Within days, Prinze's booking agents received calls worth millions of dollars. Comedy clubs that had never heard of him suddenly wanted to book him for top-tier fees. Television producers who wouldn't have returned his agent's calls were now actively pursuing him. That single wave from Johnny Carson had transformed Freddie Prinze from a struggling comedian into a hot commodity, ultimately leading to his starring role in the sitcom Chico and the Man just months later. This ability to create careers gave Carson extraordinary influence over the comedy industry. Aspiring comedians structured their entire professional development around being ready for their Tonight Show appearance. They crafted 7-minute sets specifically designed to appeal to Carson's sensibility. The Tonight Show was the venue, the only platform that truly mattered in determining whether a comedy career would succeed or fail. But Carson's kingmaker power worked in both directions. Jay Leno, who would eventually become Carson's successor through circumstances Carson neither intended nor approved, learned this painfully in the 1970s. Leno had been building a solid reputation, performing regularly at clubs and appearing on various television programs. Then Carson saw Leno perform at a comedy club and told his talent bookers that he didn't like Leno's jokes and didn't want him on The Tonight Show. Some who worked on the show suggested Carson found Leno's style too aggressive. Whatever the cause, the result was absolute. Jay Leno was barred from appearing on The Tonight Show while Johnny Carson hosted it. For Leno, this ban devastated his career momentum. Comedy clubs and television producers all wanted comedians with Tonight Show credentials. Being excluded signaled to the industry that Carson, the ultimate arbiter of comedic talent, had found Leno lacking. The absence of Tonight Show validation limited his opportunities for years. Then there was Joan Rivers. In 1983, Carson named Rivers the permanent guest host of The Tonight Show, making her the presumptive substitute whenever Carson took time off. This role represented extraordinary recognition of Rivers' talent and Carson's trust in her ability to maintain the show's quality. Rivers had been appearing on The Tonight Show regularly since the 1960s, gradually becoming one of Carson's most reliable and popular guests. Her appearances were marked by genuine chemistry, with Carson clearly enjoying her irreverent humor. When he named her permanent guest host, it seemed to validate not just her talent but their friendship. But in 1986, Rivers made a decision that shattered that relationship permanently. Fox Broadcasting offered Rivers her own late-night talk show that would air directly opposite The Tonight Show. The offer represented an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to step out from Carson's shadow and establish herself as a talk show host in her own right. Rivers accepted the Fox offer without consulting Carson first, without giving him advance notice, and without acknowledging that she was about to become his direct competitor. Carson learned about Rivers' new show by reading about it in the newspapers. The announcement blindsided him completely. Carson's response was swift and total. He never spoke to Joan Rivers again. Not a phone call, not a letter, not an acknowledgement of any kind. When Rivers attempted to contact him to explain and apologize, Carson refused to take her calls. The friendship they had built over more than 2 decades ended instantly and completely. But Carson's punishment extended far beyond personal silence. He instructed The Tonight Show's talent bookers that any guest who appeared on Rivers' Fox program was not welcome on The Tonight Show. This blacklist policy created an immediate problem because many guests had to choose between appearing on her show and maintaining their relationship with Carson. Given that The Tonight Show remained the most important promotional platform in television while Rivers' Fox show was an untested venture on a weak network, most chose Carson. The blacklist devastated Rivers' ability to book quality guests. Major stars who might have appeared to support her new venture found themselves unable to do so without sacrificing their access to The Tonight Show. Rivers' Fox program struggled without top-tier guests and was eventually canceled. Her career, which had been flourishing under Carson's patronage, suddenly faced serious challenges. Carson's treatment of Rivers revealed something essential. It wasn't merely that he could help careers by giving unknown comedians their big break. It was that he could damage or destroy careers even of established stars by withdrawing his support and actively working against them. The blacklist demonstrated that Carson's influence extended beyond his own show to affect the entire ecosystem of late-night television. As his own career approached its conclusion, that power would face its most significant test: the succession war. By 1991, Johnny Carson had been hosting The Tonight Show for 29 years. He had become an American institution, but Carson was 65 years old and ready to retire, wanting to end his run while still performing at the peak of his abilities. Carson had clear ideas about who should succeed him. David Letterman had been hosting late night since 1982. Letterman's program was produced by Carson Productions, creating a direct business relationship between the two men. More importantly, Carson admired Letterman's innovative approach to the talk show format and his genuine comedic talent. The succession seemed natural and obvious. Carson owned The Tonight Show through Carson Productions. Letterman hosted the show immediately following Carson's program, also produced by Carson's company. When Carson retired, Letterman would simply move an hour earlier and take over the franchise. But there was a critical problem. Despite owning The Tonight Show and its archives, Carson did not have contractual authority to name the next host. That decision belonged to NBC. NBC executives faced an agonizing choice. Letterman represented Carson's preference and was clearly talented enough. But Letterman was also unpredictable, prone to self-deprecating humor that sometimes bordered on self-sabotage, and openly contemptuous of television conventions. He was a wild card who might or might not maintain The Tonight Show's reliable profitability. Jay Leno presented a very different option. Despite Carson's earlier disapproval, Leno had eventually been allowed to appear and had become a regular guest host. His comedy was more accessible, his personality more reliably upbeat. Most importantly, from NBC's perspective, Leno seemed safer. Behind the scenes, Leno's manager Helen Kushnick waged an aggressive campaign to secure The Tonight Show for her client. Kushnick worked to deepen NBC's anxieties, suggesting that Letterman was too risky, that his style was too narrow. More troublingly, Kushnick planted stories in the entertainment press suggesting that NBC wanted to push Carson out before he was ready to leave. These stories were false. Carson had made his own decision to retire. But the rumors created chaos and uncertainty, making NBC executives even more nervous and more inclined to choose Leno. Carson was aware of Kushnick's tactics and was infuriated by her manipulation. But Carson faced a reality he had never encountered before. Despite his unprecedented power, he could not control this decision. NBC owned the franchise, and NBC would choose the next host. The network chose Jay Leno. The announcement devastated Letterman and represented Carson's first major defeat in 30 years. He had owned his show, controlled his schedule, moved the entire production across the country, and built a late-night empire. But he could not install his chosen successor. Carson's response was characteristically understated but unmistakably clear. During his final weeks hosting The Tonight Show in spring 1992, David Letterman was featured prominently, receiving Carson's obvious affection and respect. Jay Leno, who would take over the program just weeks after Carson's final broadcast, was notably absent from these farewell shows. The absence spoke volumes. Carson couldn't prevent Leno from becoming the next host, but he could make clear to anyone paying attention that this succession didn't have his blessing. The night NBC announced Leno as his successor, Carson called Letterman personally. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Carson said only, "They made a mistake. You're the one." Then he hung up. Letterman saved that voicemail until the tape degraded to silence. Carson's final Tonight Show broadcast on May 22, 1992, drew 50 million viewers, one of the largest audiences in late-night television history. But it was also a final exercise of Carson's power, the power to determine how his own story ended, even if he couldn't control what came next. Yet Carson discovered one final way to exercise influence. If you're discovering just how thoroughly Johnny Carson's influence shaped entertainment industry careers and power dynamics, subscribe now. We're uncovering the hidden mechanisms behind Golden Age Hollywood's most beloved stars and the extraordinary leverage they wielded behind the scenes. The Retired King's Quiet Rebellion. When Johnny Carson retired in May of 1992, most people assumed he would disappear from the entertainment industry entirely. He had made clear he wouldn't be one of those hosts who lingered, making guest appearances or publicly commenting on his successor's performance. Carson valued his privacy and had no interest in becoming the old king criticizing the new regime. True to his word, Carson withdrew from public life almost completely. He rarely gave interviews. He never appeared on television. He declined invitations to awards shows. For someone who had been so visible for 30 years, his sudden absence was remarkable. But in private, Carson maintained a professional relationship that revealed exactly where his loyalties remained. In 1993, less than a year after his retirement, Carson began writing monologue jokes and sending them to David Letterman, who by then was hosting his own show on CBS after leaving NBC in frustration. Carson wrote carefully crafted jokes that reflected his decades of experience. He would send them to Letterman without fanfare, and Letterman would perform them on his show, sometimes acknowledging they came from Carson, sometimes simply using them as part of his regular monologue. The arrangement continued from 1993 until Carson's passing in 2005, spanning 12 years. The significance extended far beyond the jokes themselves. Carson was making a calculated statement. He had retired from The Tonight Show, but he hadn't retired from comedy. And when he chose to re-engage with that world, he did so by writing for David Letterman, not for Jay Leno, the man who had inherited his desk and his time slot on NBC. Carson never publicly criticized Leno's Tonight Show. He never gave interviews suggesting Leno was the wrong choice. But his actions spoke clearly enough. For 12 years, he wrote comedy material for the host he had wanted as his successor, while maintaining complete silence toward the host NBC had actually chosen. In 1997, a Tonight Show staff member discovered Carson was writing for Letterman and leaked it to Leno. Witnesses say Leno went silent for a full minute, then said, "I guess I always knew." He never mentioned it again publicly, but the Tonight Show's bookers quietly made it harder for Letterman's guests to appear on NBC programs. Letterman understood the significance of receiving these jokes from Carson. In interviews years later, he described the experience as both thrilling and humbling, a continued endorsement from the man who had created the template for modern late-night television. Each envelope represented validation that he was the rightful heir, even if he sat at a different network. This arrangement represented a new form of power for Carson, the authority of absence and selective engagement. He couldn't control who hosted The Tonight Show after his retirement, but he could control which post-Carson late-night host received his support. Even without a television show, without a public platform, Johnny Carson's endorsement still mattered enormously. The joke-writing arrangement also demonstrated something essential about Carson's character. He wasn't vindictive toward Leno personally. He didn't wage a public campaign to undermine Leno's Tonight Show. He simply withdrew his support completely and directed his creative energy toward the host he believed deserved it. This selective engagement was more powerful than open criticism, precisely because it was understated and required no explanation. These personal acts of loyalty emerged from the broader influence Carson had exercised for decades, including a decision years earlier that reshaped where entertainment itself happened. The California move that changed everything. In 1972, 20 years before his retirement, Johnny Carson announced The Tonight Show would move from New York City to Burbank, California. The decision appeared to be about personal preference. Carson had spent 10 years hosting the show from NBC's studios in Manhattan, but he wanted to live in California. For decades, New York City had been the undisputed center of American television production. The major networks maintained their headquarters there. The Tonight Show had been broadcast from New York since its inception. Carson's decision represented more than a change of scenery. It was a test of whether The Tonight Show belonged to NBC and its New York headquarters, or whether it belonged to Johnny Carson and would exist wherever he chose to do it. NBC executives initially refused. The costs to rebuild in California would exceed $10 million. For 3 months, the standoff continued, with Carson refusing to commit to another season unless the show relocated. NBC faced a choice: spend $10 million or lose $50 million annually. NBC chose accommodation. The network agreed to Carson's relocation and began moving The Tonight Show's production to Burbank. New studios had to be built. Technical staff had to be hired or relocated. The entire apparatus of late-night television production had to be reconstructed on the West Coast to accommodate one performer's preference. The decision destroyed careers overnight. NBC staff in New York who couldn't relocate lost their jobs. Performers who had built their lives around easy access to Tonight Show tapings suddenly faced a choice: uproot their families or watch their careers stall. Ed McMahon later admitted the move nearly destroyed his marriage. His wife refused to leave New York for 2 years. Dick Cavett, whose ABC show remained in New York, publicly suggested Carson had abandoned the intellectual capital of American television for swimming pools and sunshine. Carson's response was characteristically brutal. He never mentioned Cavett's show again, effectively erasing a competitor through silence. The move reflected what cultural analysts later described as a broader realignment of American pop culture. Throughout the 1960s and early 70s, the entertainment industry's center of gravity was shifting from East Coast to West Coast. Carson's move to California didn't single-handedly cause this shift. It was happening already. But Carson's decision to move The Tonight Show accelerated and validated that shift. When the most important program in late-night television relocated to California, it sent a signal throughout the industry. Performers who wanted to appear on the show now traveled to Studio One in Burbank. The West Coast became increasingly established as a legitimate center for television production. What made Carson's move particularly significant was that NBC had no real choice but to accommodate it. If any other host had requested such a relocation, the network could have simply replaced them. But Carson wasn't replaceable, so when Carson said the show was moving to California, NBC's only realistic option was to move it. Studio One in Burbank became the new destination for anyone who wanted to reach The Tonight Show's audience of 15 million nightly viewers. The change reinforced Hollywood's growing dominance as the center of American entertainment. Carson's geographic power was matched by his influence over something even more significant: the political consciousness of the nation. The comedian who moved the polls. Richard Nixon understood Johnny Carson's power intimately. White House recordings released years later revealed Nixon telling his advisors he would rather have Johnny Carson on my side than every newspaper in the country. When Carson's jokes about Watergate intensified in 1974, Nixon's press secretary noted a pattern. Negative poll numbers spiked within 48 hours of Carson monologues. The administration briefly considered having surrogates appear on The Tonight Show, but abandoned the plan when they realized Carson controlled which clips would air and which would be mocked. In 1979, Johnny Carson sat for an interview on the CBS News program 60 Minutes. Correspondent Mike Wallace asked Carson about his influence and whether he used The Tonight Show to shape public opinion. Carson's response was careful and deliberate. "You could sway people," he acknowledged, "and I don't think you should be an entertainer." Carson positioned himself as someone who avoided using his platform for serious political advocacy. He saw his role as entertaining people, helping them relax, perhaps offering gentle observations about current events, but not attempting to shape their political views. This stance of claim neutrality was central to Carson's public image. But academic researchers studying Carson's actual impact discovered something more complex. Scholars used statistical time series models to examine whether his comedy about political figures had measurable effects on public opinion. Their research focused particularly on 1972 to 1974, when Carson frequently made jokes about President Richard Nixon. What the researchers found was evidence of what they termed the Carson effect, a statistically significant correlation between Carson's jokes about Nixon and measurable changes in the president's public approval ratings. When Carson made fun of Nixon more frequently or more sharply, Nixon's approval numbers tended to decline. The correlation wasn't absolute, but it was consistent enough to suggest Carson's comedy had real political impact. The Carson effect worked because of how audiences perceived Carson himself. He wasn't a partisan commentator. He was seen as representing what scholars called the middle-class elegance of mainstream America, a sensible observer who reflected consensus views rather than trying to create them. When Carson made a joke about a political figure, audiences didn't interpret it as a partisan attack. They interpreted it as mainstream consensus observation. If Johnny Carson, who seemed above the political fray, was making fun of someone, that person must have done something genuinely worthy of mockery. Carson's apparent neutrality was precisely what made his political comedy influential. This created a fascinating paradox. He genuinely believed he was avoiding political influence and simply entertaining his audience. But the statistical evidence suggested his commentary had measurable effects on public opinion. His professed neutrality was itself a form of power, the ability to shape political discourse while maintaining the protective cover of being just a comedian. Carson never acknowledged the Carson effect research. He maintained throughout his career that he was an entertainer, not a political commentator, and that his jokes were meant to amuse rather than persuade. But whether Carson intended political influence or not, the research suggested his voice mattered in shaping how Americans thought about their political leaders. This was particularly significant during the Nixon presidency and Watergate, when public opinion shifted dramatically, and Carson's monologues consistently mocked Nixon's troubles. The Carson effect represented a different kind of power than his economic leverage or his control of individual careers. It was the power to shape national conversation, to influence how millions processed political information. Carson wielded this power while claiming not to, which may have been precisely what made it so effective. Which revelation about Carson's power surprised you most? Did NBC make the right choice in the succession battle between Letterman and Leno? And what golden age Hollywood topic should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below. The unrepeatable sovereignty. From contract negotiations to career gatekeeping, from succession battles to political influence, Carson's power touched every aspect of television. But understanding why that power mattered requires recognizing what made it historically unique and why it can never be replicated. At the peak of his career in the 1980s, Johnny Carson commanded an audience of 15 million viewers every night. Those 15 million people represented a genuine mass audience, a shared cultural experience that cut across demographic lines. This concentration of attention gave Carson leverage and influence that seems almost impossible to imagine today. The Tonight Show, at its peak, generated approximately 17% of NBC's annual pre-tax profit. A single program, airing 1 hour per night, accounted for nearly 1/5 of everything NBC earned. This economic significance gave Carson bargaining power that allowed him to own his show, control his schedule, determine production locations, and resist network pressure in ways that would be unthinkable for any performer today. But this raises a question that haunts everyone who has followed Carson. Why has no host since achieved anything approaching this level of power? The answer lies in fundamental changes to the television ecosystem. Carson hosted The Tonight Show during an era when Americans had limited viewing options. Three major broadcast networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, dominated the landscape. Cable television existed but hadn't yet fragmented the audience. Streaming services were decades away. If you wanted to watch something at 11:30 at night, your realistic options were The Tonight Show, whatever CBS and ABC were counter-programming, or turning off the television. This limited competition meant that Carson's 15 million nightly viewers represented a genuinely massive share of available audience. His dominance wasn't just popularity, it was near monopoly on late-night viewership. Modern television exists in a completely different environment. Hundreds of cable channels compete for attention. Streaming services offer unlimited on-demand content. Social media platforms provide alternative entertainment. The three-network oligopoly that enabled Carson's concentration of audience attention has been replaced by extreme fragmentation. No late-night host today can achieve 15 million viewers consistently because there simply aren't 15 million people watching any single late-night program anymore. The audience has been divided among multiple hosts across multiple networks, and further divided by people watching content online, streaming movies, or scrolling through social media. This fragmentation means no contemporary host can generate 17% of a network's profit through a single program. Networks now maintain diverse revenue streams across numerous programs and platforms. Without that economic leverage, contemporary hosts cannot negotiate ownership arrangements comparable to what Carson secured. Carson's ability to move The Tonight Show from New York to California worked because NBC had no alternative. Losing Carson would have meant losing the franchise entirely. Modern production decisions involve numerous economic factors beyond any single performer's leverage. The kingmaker power that allowed Carson to create careers with a wave or destroy them with a blacklist operated in an environment where The Tonight Show was the only platform that truly mattered for launching comedy careers. Today, comedians can build substantial followings through Netflix specials, YouTube channels, podcasts, and social media. The Tonight Show remains important, but is no longer the sole gatekeeper. Even Carson's political influence through the Carson effect depended on a media environment where late-night television monologues represented a significant portion of how Americans encountered political comedy. Today, political humor comes from dozens of sources. No single voice dominates the way Carson's did. All of this means that Johnny Carson's level of power was not just impressive, it was historically contingent on circumstances that will never align again. He was the right performer, with the right skills, at the right moment in television history, when the medium structure allowed for concentrated audience attention and overwhelming economic leverage. Carson wasn't just powerful. He was the last entertainer who could be that powerful in television. The three-network era that made his dominance possible ended shortly after his retirement. Cable expansion and internet streaming fragmented the audience irreversibly. The concentrated mass culture that allowed 15 million people to share the same late-night experience has been replaced by niche audiences. In 2005, when Johnny Carson passed away at age 79, David Letterman was informed during a commercial break on his CBS show. He finished the program, went to his dressing room, and wept. Jay Leno, hosting The Tonight Show that same night, delivered a brief on-air tribute but never acknowledged the 12 years of silence between them. 3 days later, Letterman devoted his entire show to Carson. He read aloud from the handwritten jokes Carson had sent him over the years, jokes no one else would ever see, private endorsements that meant more than any public award. He didn't have to write these, Letterman said, his voice breaking. He didn't have to care, but he did. That's what Carson's power ultimately meant, not the contracts or the ratings or the money. It was that for 12 years after retirement, his opinion still mattered enough to make David Letterman feel validated and Jay Leno feel invisible. No entertainer since has held that kind of authority, not because they lack talent, but because the world Carson dominated no longer exists. Future late-night hosts will continue to entertain audiences, launch comedy careers, and influence popular culture, but none will own their shows the way Carson owned his. None will generate such a disproportionate share of network profit. None will command audiences large enough to reshape industry geography. None will possess the concentrated cultural authority that made Carson's endorsement career-defining and his disapproval career-threatening. Johnny Carson wasn't just the king of late night. He was the last emperor of television's monoculture era, the final performer who could genuinely claim to speak to a unified national audience night after night for decades. His power was real, quantifiable, and transformative. It was also impossible to maintain once the conditions that created it dissolved. If this exploration of Johnny Carson's unprecedented influence revealed dimensions of television history you'd never considered, please like this video and share it with anyone who remembers when late-night television meant gathering around the TV at 11:30 to watch Johnny. The power he wielded wasn't just impressive, it was the closing chapter of an era that will never return, making his 3 decades behind that desk not just successful but historically unrepeatable. Subscribe for more revelations about the stars who shaped entertainment when television could still create genuine cultural monarchs, and discover why their influence remains impossible to match in our fragmented modern media landscape.